The United Nations turns 80 this year. For 8 decades, it's been the place where the world sits down together. 193 countries, all of them still showing up. But showing up isn't the same as paying up.
The United Nations needs to envision what it looks like without U.S. money, without U.S. leadership.
International law is not only for small states, and large states can do whatever they want. I think that's a crisis that we face right now.
The United States, the UN's founding member and largest funder, hasn't paid its dues in years. And without that money, roughly a quarter of the budget, the organization is freezing hiring, cutting staff, and scaling back the basics.
But imagine you're running any organization, you're running this college, you're running a small business, and you're not getting essentially 25% of your money from one country. The other 15% from China is coming in late as well. You cannot run an organization that way.
At the same time, debates over who holds power at the Security Council, still structured around the 5 victors of World War II, are coming back to the surface. No permanent African member, no permanent Latin American member. A decision-making body that, as one former ambassador puts it, reflects a world that doesn't exist anymore.
Within the Council, it is evident that there is polarization. Everyone is entrenched behind its position, and we do not see the willingness to discuss, to talk, even if we disagree.
And then there's the question of what comes next. A new Secretary General will be selected this year. Only 2 candidates have formally declared. Some see it as a poisoned chalice. So, can the UN reform itself fast enough to stay relevant? What happens when the institution built to hold the world together starts to come apart at the seams? And is there still a path forward?
I think it survives, but I think it will look very different after this.
Of the 193 member states that are members of the UN, that comprise the UN, they're all present in New York, every single one. No one is leaving the UN.
This is Global Insights by Network 2020. Today, the future of the United Nations. This event was co-hosted with the Borough of Manhattan Community College. Moderating the discussion today is Dr. Waheguru Paul Singh Sidhu, clinical professor and director of the UN Specialization at the Center for Global Affairs, New York University.
So let me begin by very briefly introducing them. And I'll start with Ambassador Aglaia Balta, who's the permanent representative of Greece since 2025. Next, we have a former ambassador, but now the James Schlesinger Distinguished Professor at the University of Virginia's Miller Center, Ambassador Chris Liu, who has had a phenomenal experience in public service of over 3 decades in all 3 branches of the federal government, which is quite remarkable in itself. Last but not the least, we have Ambassador Carolyn Rodrigues-Birkett, Dr. Birkett, who is the permanent representative of the Co-operative Republic of Guyana to the United Nations. And I also would be remiss in mentioning that Guyana has just stepped off the Security Council as an elected member, and Greece is just coming onto the UN Security Council as a elected member. Of course, the United States never left. So with that, let me turn to all of you with this kind of key question and contextualize it with the discussions we've seen coming particularly out of Davos. Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney saying this is a rupture in the global institutions, global order, and there's no going back. We also have the Prime Minister of Greece saying actually it's not quite a disruption. In that sense, he hasn't given up on NATO, among others. So I want to pose it to all of you. Where do you think we are at this juncture? Is this a rupture? And of the 3 options, which one do you think is confronting the United Nations today? Destruction, disruption, or discontinuity? Ambassador Balta, why don't we start with you?
Good evening to all. It's what you want to be and where you want to be. It's not either or, it's a continuum. This year we have celebrated 80 years of the foundation of the United Nations organization. And there is a lot of talk as to where the organization is going. Is it obsolete or is something that can be saved and move on to the next, for the next generation? I'm one of those who truly believe that it's just a phase and it's up to us, it's the responsibility of the 193 countries forming the UN to decide if they want to leave the organization aside or transform it. Because the question is how we move, because 80 years ago, the world was different. It came out of a disastrous world war, and my country, which was one of the founding members of the UN, was completely destroyed. But then, within this new order of universal world, we started moving on. And in 80 years, we had great progress. And I would like to believe that at present day, what is happening because of the new technologies, because of new crises that the world has not yet cannot digest, because our world is different. We are different. We are not the humans that formed the UN. So we have to take this into account and just try to distill the new conditions in a new UN.
Thank you very much for that. And clearly, the UN has succeeded in creating norms which never existed before, and particularly in areas where there are new technologies coming, new challenges, climate change, pandemic, etc. There is certainly much, much more scope for the UN. And we'll come back to that as well. Who would like to come in on the next? Dr. Birkett, please. Yeah.
Not doctor,
okay.
But thank you, Professor Sidhu. And disruption, destruction, discontinuity, what you mentioned, I think I perhaps would call it an inflection. Because apart from the UN and what is happening, there are lots of other things happening in the world. You mentioned technology, artificial intelligence. We have issues to deal with climate change. And I think what is different now is just the speed at which things are happening. But in your introduction, you also spoke about, will the UN get to 100 years? And I would say definitely yes, and even more. When you look at the UN right now, you would see that of the 193 member states that are members of the UN, that comprise the UN, they're all present in New York, every single one. No one is leaving the UN. So in terms of its membership, everyone is there. But also, if we analyze where the UN is going, we must also look what the UN has done. And for these last 80 years, the UN has delivered. From providing humanitarian assistance, the norm setting that you spoke about, decolonization, including for my own country, Guyana. And when we think about the UN, we should not think about that square building on First Avenue. We have to think about the UN in terms of the WHO, who manages global health. And so I would say that the UN is the international validator of what we do as countries and what we do globally together for the planet. It is also our global early warning system. So the UN is too big and too global and too useful to fail. And so it will be there at 100 years.
Thank you very much. And that's wonderful to hear, particularly for our young students here who are looking forward to careers and working with and on the UN as well. So much, much appreciated there. Ambassador Liu, to you.
Thank you for having me. Let me start by saying the UN is absolutely indispensable. If you go back 80 years and look at why the United Nations was created, which was to prevent the next great war, By that standard, the UN has been phenomenally successful. I think the question is what it looks like and what is the role of the United States. U.S. administrations have, I wouldn't say have a hot-cold relationship with the UN, but what we are seeing and what we've seen in the last year is completely out of the bounds of what we've seen over the past 80 years. The U.S. is not only just a founding member, it is the founding member of the United Nations. And so to many of us, it is concerning to see the United States walk away from the United Nations. And we think it's short-sighted not only for U.S. security interests, we think it's more importantly concerning about what it means about our leadership around the world, the role that we want to play in terms of values and norm setting in terms of human rights. So I think the question of what the UN looks like 20 years from now, 100 years from now, it depends. If after this next administration we have future U.S. presidents who revert to the norm, pay the dues, engage constructively, work within the system to reform it, I think we get back to sort of where we were before. But it's also very possible that this, where we see right now, this nativist trend here in the United States, this move against multilateralism, could become a longer-term trend. And then I think if that were to happen, the United Nations needs to envision what it looks like without U.S. money, without U.S. leadership. Is that a greater role for countries like China here at the United Nations? Is it something like Prime Minister Carney laid out, a broader group of middle powers being engaged in the process? So I think it survives, but I think it will look very different after this.
And thank you for that. And I just want to pick up on one topic which has already come up quite a bit, and that is the Carney speech as well. And to one extent, the fact that you had at the same meeting in Davos, President Trump also setting up the Board of Peace, which in the same sort of breath was described as might replace the UN or might work with the UN. And we still don't know. The jury's still out on that one. But in that context, given, and I'm delighted to hear the optimism here about the UN, does that pose any sort of existential challenge, given the fact that there are countries signing up to the Board of Peace, particularly in the context of the UN Security Council? And I know that's the only thing most people tend to focus on.
In the realm of optimism where have found, I think everything can be complementary to the UN. The resolution 2803 on Gaza that was adopted by the Council has the Board of Peace included in the process of restoring peace and security on Gaza. So I don't see, for me personally, that it's one thing or the other. Our world has become very complex to not try to find ways in order to move forward and resolve crisis. At the moment, if you look around the globe, you can see how many dire crises we are faced with. So anything that can help to solve situations, I think it's only useful.
Thank you for that. And their individual sacrifices and contributions are certainly, to be recognized. Ambassador Liu, on this particular question of the alternatives that are coming up to the UN.
I think if the answer is how do we get more parties to the table to deal with the reconstruction of Gaza, to find a permanent solution for the Palestinians and the Israelis, I welcome as many countries that want to come to the table on this. But to create an alternate structure that requires countries to pay into it as an alternate peacemaking entity honestly makes no sense at all. I mean, that is really the role of a Secretary General using his good offices. And we can have a whole conversation about whether this Secretary General has effectively done that.
Please do.
I don't think he has. I mean, I think when we look at the two major crises that we've faced over the last 5 years, Ukraine, Gaza, we haven't seen an engaged Secretary General. The challenge is, and again, this is endemic to the makeup of the United Nations, when you have one of the 5 permanent members involved in each of these crises, that by necessity makes the Security Council action incredibly difficult. I mean, I could say this as a U.S. diplomat. We in 2022 said that we were going to be judicious in the use of our veto.
That's right, yes.
Gaza happens, and then we're not very judicious in the use of our veto. So I think this posed a special challenge for the Secretary General.
You mentioned Article 27.3 of the Charter, which states that countries that are party to a dispute should not take part in the vote, at least on that. I don't have a lot of hope that is going to happen, because we have seen that it has not happened where it concerns P5 and even some elected members as well. So I think that it's well-intentioned in the Charter, but I cannot see it happening, because you're not going to have two categories in the Council where some could do it and some would have to abide with it.
Right. So it's going to become almost like a new norm, unfortunately, as well. And in the context of the Council, for a minute or two, in the more recent years, the elected 10, the E10, have become far more dynamic, shall I say, far more activist in many ways. And, and there is also the issue of the sixth veto, which is getting the 9 votes or not getting 9 votes, which is where, again, the E10 can play a role. So do you see possibilities there, but also the emergency special sessions, the Uniting for Peace resolution, so more and more going into the General Assembly if the Council is not able to do or deal with peace and security sort of issues? And again, to all of you, given your experiences.
My colleague completed 2 years in the Council. I want to hear her experience.
Yes, I think the E10 has a lot of potential, but it all depends also on the composition of the E10 as well, because it's a mixed group of countries. And so I think it would be case by case, issue by issue. And the E10 was able to come together on a number of occasions when it comes to Gaza. But we must admit that Gaza was an extreme case. And, it was just unconscionable for us to not come together and push something there. But we were also able to come together when the Secretary General was declared persona non grata. And we were able to make a statement as E10, even if the Council as a whole was having a difficulty in doing that. And the E10 has spoken as one on many issues, on several issues. But there's great potential and there is great responsibility of the E10, because the E10's constituency is the General Assembly. The P5 constituency is basically their countries. That's the difference.
I want to do a little level setting for the folks in the audience, because I think we're getting into the weeds here, just so folks understand the makeup of the Security Council. So there are 15 members of the Council. 5 are permanent members, so they sit every single year. Those are the 5 victorious powers from World War II. So it's U.S., Russia, China, UK, and France. And then the other 10 rotate. I point that out because the Security Council really is an anachronism. It reflects a world that does not exist right now. And it's one of the reasons why, and again, I'm proud to have served under President Biden, and we made a conscious decision to move forward on Security Council reform. It is notable among the permanent members. There is no representative of Africa. There's no representative of Latin America. The veto power is only held by those 5 countries, and they can veto any changes to their veto power as well. So it's not a representative body. So again, we can talk a little bit more about Security Council reform, the likelihood of it. I'm not particularly optimistic, particularly in this climate, but I think a more effective UN will require a more effective Security Council.
Anything? Yeah.
I'll come back to your first question, what is needed. Within the Council, it is evident that there is polarization. Everyone is entrenched behind its position, and we do not see the willingness to discuss, to talk, even if we disagree, the willingness to find a solution, a common ground. This is the problem. But I would like to come back on the need to reform the Council.
Okay.
If we want to move and to have changes that reflect the international situation, now we have to reform. And as you said, the geographical representation of the Council at the moment is not the appropriate one.
Absolutely. I want to come back to a question that has come up time and time again, which is on the finances. And Ambassador Birkett, you rightly said, one member is stepping out of some of these agencies, organizations, etc. But that one member has also been in arrears for the last 3 years and actually has practically refused to pay for some of these. And of course, I'm talking about the United States. So even in the regular budget, which of course Guyana and Greece have regularly paid on time, has actually been a big hole in the budget. So how does the rest of the 192 countries or 192 members address this huge gap, financial gap?
I don't have the solution, but just to say that we basically pay, we all agree to the formula for payment, and all of our countries. And so we all carry, I would say, equal weight based on the size of our economy. But I also, not directly answering your question, I think this is an opportunity. This time of challenge is an opportunity for the UN to fast-track certain reforms. And I'm speaking here separately from Security Council reform. But I think what we have to be careful is that we do not cut our coat according to our cloth and not according to the coat we need, or else we could end up half naked in winter. So I think we have to be very careful with that. Mm-hmm. But we have not been able to get to a text. It's the single process in the UN without a text, and it's still called negotiations. Mm-hmm. So that is an anomaly that we have to fix. The structure and the decision-making of the Council is what is decision-making rules of the Council, is what is keeping the Council back from acting, and we spoke about the veto earlier. I don't want to be as pessimistic as Chris on Security Council reform. I just cannot afford to be pessimistic. We have to be optimistic because I believe in moments. Mm-hmm. Moments come. And when the war in Ukraine started, there was a moment. And I remember it was then the US started to speak more vociferously on reform. And so I think we may have a moment where we can push forward with reform. And all of us agree in the General Assembly that the historical injustice against Africa, without having a permanent member there, must be addressed. And so we've been able to agree on that. So I think there will be moments, and if we seize those moments, we would be able to push forward with reform.
Yeah, no, I think for this audience, let me level set again how this funding works. There is a formula that looks at the size of, essentially it's your GDP, the size of your economy divided by the number of people. So the United States and China essentially have the same size of GDP, but they have more people than we have. So we essentially pay, I don't know, depending on how you count, it's between 22 and 26% of the budget. China pays about 15%. That's how you get the 40% that's paid for by two countries. The United States has not paid, I think, the last 2 years at least.
Yes.
At this point. If we don't pay, we actually lose our vote in the General Assembly, which is pretty crazy because I think the only other country that does not have a vote is Venezuela right now.
Yes.
That's quite a company to be in at this moment. Yeah. But imagine you're running any organization, you're running this college, you're running a small business, and you're not getting essentially 25% of your money from one country. The other 15% from China is coming in late as well. You cannot run an organization that way.
Let me turn maybe to the last sort of set of question, and that is we are also in the year where there's going to be a new Secretary General selected. The process has been changed a little bit. Do you see this as an opportunity for the inflection point that the UN is at and the kind of new direction that it's going to be, and what kind of a person would you be willing to see in that position? You're likely to support? Who do you think, if you're looking at the crystal ball, out of the 192 members, might support, and in what direction might they move in terms of the Secretary General? Anyone? Yes, please.
In honor of my friend Carolyn, I would say that it's the turn of Latin America and the woman.
Okay. Okay.
I think that thank you, Aggie, for recognizing that it is the turn of Latin America and the Caribbean. And also, there has been lots of recognition that a woman has never served as Secretary General. But there isn't an agreement as such that it will be, but there's that recognition. Yeah. And many countries are looking in that direction. The Secretary General is as strong as the power we allow him as member states. And so I would not want to have a Secretary General that we scapegoat as well. So how much the Secretary General can do.
And on the Secretary General, and of course, there has been a very active movement, one for 8 billion, others for a woman Secretary General. But just in the reality of things, you also have 5 permanent members who actually start, in a way, have the final, sadly, vote on who's going to become the Secretary General. And it's inconceivable to think of the P5 at the moment, the 5 permanent members, and to see whether some of them would actually be willing to support a woman candidate at this juncture. But with that...
Yeah, no, I'll also add the other dynamic. So the Security Council has to recommend the Secretary General candidate. The General Assembly approves it. So not only do you have to navigate the dynamics of gender, you have to find a candidate who all P5, and you're really actually talking about the U.S., China, and Russia, all either or don't hate. That's a hard combination. It's kind of that Goldilocks, not too hot, not too cold. And that's a very complicated road to navigate. And right now, as you know, there's only been 2 announced candidates.
I was just going to come to that as well. And then I am going to open it up for questions, please. So keep them ready. On that, as of now, we're now in February. Yes, I know there's still time to go, but there's only been 2 formally declared candidates. One of them is Rafael Grossi, who is the present head of the International Atomic Energy Agency from Argentina. And the other is the only woman so far, Michelle Bachelet, from Chile, also supported by Brazil and Mexico as well. So is this in some ways an indication that the Secretary General position has become a poison chalice?
There's time. I think there is a bit of a corridor talk that those who come out too early, it's like the video game when you start shooting down, that kind of thing. But I'm sure there are going to be other candidates in that as we go forward. So I think it's still early days.
Please, yeah.
As Carolyn said, it's too soon to have the whole picture. And usually those who present themselves early on, they tend to get burned. So let's wait and see. I don't have any doubt that there are candidates for this position.
Absolutely. Well, this is what the expectation was the last time as well. But with that, let me open it up for questions, if I might. Yes, please identify yourself.
Okay, thank you. My name is Mithila. I'm a business administration major at BMCC. My question is to Ambassador Chris Lu. You said UN Security Council represents a world that doesn't exist. Could you elaborate on that in relation to the Security Council's main goal, as it is a main UN agency that holds a lot of impact in global decision?
Yeah, so again, if you believe the most important function or the most powerful function of the Security Council is the veto, that's currently held by the 5 victorious powers of World War II. I'm not going to call out any particular countries, but I'm not sure that's the 5 you would necessarily choose in this environment. Think about the most populous country in India, not being a permanent member, the major European power, Germany, the other major Asian power, Japan, the biggest country or the most powerful country in Latin America, Brazil, South Africa. So that the current makeup does not reflect the power dynamics in the world, nor would you actually have a Security Council where you had no permanent African members. So we, under the Biden administration, supported actually 2 permanent members from Africa, 1 from Latin America. We supported India, Germany, Japan. We also supported having a small island developing state as a member of the Security Council because we thought they had very unique interests as it related to climate change. But again, it needs to happen. The conversations are happening. But we can't even agree on whether we should even have this text-based negotiations right now, much less putting the words on paper.
Should some of the existing permanent members step down?
I don't want to offend any countries right now, so.
I'm being cheeky, of course. Yes, please.
Thank you.
We'll take that question and then we can come back to there as well. Yes, please.
So my question speaks to the Security Council reform, and particularly the idea of how reform debates are often framed as a trade-off between, representativeness and effectiveness, right? But we know that declining legitimacy also reduces compliance and effectiveness. So I guess in your views, is the bigger threat an ineffective or illegitimate one? And so my follow-up to that question would be, I love the aspirations and the optimism, but what concrete steps can member states take to support the integrity and the independence and the effectiveness use of institutions such as, the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Courts, and how these efforts complement ongoing discussions on Security Council reform, including restraint on the P5 veto? Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I think that's open to everybody.
I'm afraid there is no answer to this question. Flat, there's no answer because at present, in order to move and solve what you said, reinforce international courts, reform the Security Council, there needs to be a conversation. There needs to be a minimum of common base. And I will repeat it again, when we are entrenched in our own positions, we cannot move. So all of us around the Council or the membership of the UN has to understand that in order to have something, a common denominator, we have to discuss and find a solution that will not be agreeable to all. At present, we all need to have 100% of what we believe to be true. If we do not start to have a decent dialogue, a decent conversation, so as to find solutions, I'm afraid my answer to your question is no. And you saw earlier I was being very optimistic, but for what you've asked me,
I want to point out one important reform that has happened. It used to be that when one of the P5 vetoed, they just vetoed and then we moved on. Back in 2022, Liechtenstein, tiny Liechtenstein, pushed through an initiative that if there was a veto in the Security Council, the country that vetoes has to go before the entire General Assembly. It was also thought that if you had to explain your veto, that might deter the P5 from vetoing as much. That hasn't happened. But what it has done is given the entire membership of the General Assembly a chance to opine on what happens in the Security Council. And I think that's an important measure. Now, it hasn't gone far enough. It hasn't really deterred it. But it does provide, I wouldn't say legitimacy, but more engagement by other countries in what happens in the Security Council.
And that was a moment.
That was a moment.
It was a moment that came, again, with the Ukrainian crisis. And so this is why I believe that we could have moments. I also think that the declining legitimacy that you spoke about, I think would be a factor in perhaps motivating reform, including by the P5. And I say this because if your relevance, your global relevance and peace and security comes from your membership of the Council as a veto-wielding member, you might not want that relevance to decline. But let me also temper that with my belief that the Security Council is actually the amplifier of the geopolitical situation of the day, and not the other way around. So if the great powers are living well together and so on, you might see more progress there. If there is fissures, you're not going to see that. But the concern of many of us is the impunity that exists right now. And I think it has increased tremendously. And there is no enforcement mechanism for that. So we have to make sure that international law is upheld. And international law is not only for small states. And large states can do whatever they want. I think that's a crisis that we face right now, I would say. because then you give license. If the ones who you look up to, who have the privilege, doing the things that they expect you to do, then you get license to do them as well. And that's a big worry. But I would not still be pessimistic that we cannot reform the Security Council.
Okay, on that note, and I know we could have carried on for a little longer as well, and I apologize for those who did not get a chance to ask their questions. Let me, on behalf of all of you, thank our fantastic panel who have really been very, very candid and taken my provocations in the spirit that was meant by being even more transparent and candid. And I think the bottom line really for me is that 80 years on, the UN has some tremendous successes. The biggest one, perhaps, is the normative structures that it has created for all of us to follow. It's inconceivable for us to think of a UN without the world without the UN today. But the challenge, of course, is it is now 193 countries. It began as 51. And I think the way that it's going to move forward, if we want to prevent the destruction part here, is for it to be disruptive, and to be disruptive in a positive way, and to do things which are much more pragmatic that we need for the 21st century. But if you want to study and understand all of that, then you certainly need to turn to this fantastic panel. So please, on behalf of all of you, a quick vote of thanks to all of them.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Global Insights. You can subscribe to Global Insights on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your audio. For more analysis, events, and ways to connect with our community, click on the link in the description. See you next time.